Hey there, before I get into the video, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone that helped me hit 1,000 subs. As a thank you, I'm going to give away a copy of Fire Emblem Engage. I'll go over the details about that at the end of the video. I've just finished my second playthrough of Fire Emblem Engage, and I have to say it has some of the best gameplay in the entire series, and one of my favorite parts has been Maddening mode, the game's highest difficulty. Before I had a chance to play it, I was really worried about Maddening mode in Engage because it's a difficulty mode that really annoyed me in Three Houses. The Three Houses Maddening mode had moments where it shined, but it often felt frustrating due to mechanics like unpredictable ambush reinforcements, or had maps that incentivized cheese strategies like using warp and stride to ignore a map's challenge and just charge right to the boss, completing the map, but in pretty boring fashion. This is mainly a problem in Part 2 of Three Houses, where a majority of maps can be cleared in just a turn or two. After seeing some of the powers and mobility tools you get in Engage, including multiple warps, movement increases, and even a 4-way dancer, I was worried that Engage Maddening was going to basically be a rerun of Three Houses, where maps could be very frustrating if you didn't cheese them, but trivially easy if you did. Fortunately, Engage really nailed Maddening mode, and the gameplay as a whole. I'm going to talk about my experience with Engage's mechanics and what worked and what didn't work for me. Many of the things I'm going to talk about apply to all difficulties, but I'm going to be focusing on how they impact the experience of a Maddening run primarily. I'll also be talking about some of the maps I really like, so if you want to go in completely blind or don't want to know anything about the story, maybe save this video until after you finish the game. The start of Maddening mode in Engage really eases you in. You don't have many emblems, and the maps just play out as slightly harder versions of the maps on hard mode. Most of the strategies that I used in my hard mode playthrough also worked here, but I needed to be a little bit more careful with ally positioning to ensure that I was using the tankiness of Vander, this game's Jagan, to the best of my ability. One difference in Maddening's early game compared to hard is the importance of this game's version of the weapon triangle. Attacking with weapon triangle advantage in this game breaks the defender, preventing them from counterattacking. Most of your units can't take more than one hit without a heal, but may also take 3 attacks or more to kill an enemy. It's usually not possible to bait enemies one by one, so this often means you need to break an enemy if you want to kill them without putting one of your attackers at risk on enemy phase. You can't ignore the weapon triangle, and you need to be proactive on player phase while trying to avoid enemy phase combat as much as possible. The break system is a lot more important on player phase than enemy, because all that's lost from breaking on enemy phase is a counterattack. It doesn't make your unit any more likely to die. On player phase though, breaking an enemy opens them up to more attacks from squishier or low health allies that might not be able to attack an enemy that could counterattack them. Backup units in this game also introduce a new layer of micro decisions. When a backup unit is in range of an enemy that you attack with a different unit, they lead off the fight with a small attack called a chain attack that deals damage equal to a percentage of the enemy's health. Most importantly, they do not get counterattacked. This means you can do things like putting Boucheron between 3 enemies with a hand axe, and if you attack each of those enemies, he could do up to 9 damage without ever eating a counterattack. Placing backup units well allows you to maximize your damage output while minimizing danger to your team. Since the attacks do damage based on the enemy's max health, they're even useful against enemies that would otherwise take no damage from the backup unit. I spent a lot of time thinking about the best way to place a backup unit to get the most damage out of them, and sometimes you might even make a worse attack in order to set up the maximum amount of chain attacks. Backup units can also create situations where it's useful to attack even if you do 0 damage, because even a unit that can't damage an opponent can still trigger chain attacks from their allies. Beyond backup units, early game Maddening also introduces you to other unit types, namely armored units. Armored units are beefier than ever before, and they can't be broken via weapon triangle disadvantage. A lot of your physical attackers will have trouble doing significant damage to armored enemies, so your best bet is using magic attacks that hit their low resistance, and backup units that can bypass their defenses. This has always kind of been true in Fire Emblem games, but it's more true in this game than ever. Even in the late game, a lot of your physical attackers can't do much damage to armored units, so you're always going to want to have at least one mage on the team. The different unit types provide a lot of incentive to have class diversity. You want a magic unit to deal with armored enemies, and backup units are all foot units, so you'll want a few of those as well, but you also might want a flyer or a high mobility unit to help get to some of the side objectives in a timely manner. Picking your team is a lot more difficult in Engage than just selecting the best combat units and high mobility units, and my endgame team was nowhere near as homogenized as it was in Three Houses, where my team was a bunch of Wyvern Lords and a few support units to supercharge them. It also feels like there are a lot of viable ways to build a team in Engage. My first run was a more traditional Fire Emblem team, including lots of mounted units and staff users. But my second run, I made a team of as many backup units as I could to maximize chain attack damage. The last feature introduced in the early game of Engage is Emblem Rings. You start off with Marth, one of the simpler rings to understand. He adds some survivability and damage, and his Engage attack makes him your best tool for boss killing at the end of each map. One of the biggest differences between easier difficulties and Maddening is that in Maddening you want to be making more liberal use of these rings. Each ring only lasts 3 turns before needing to be recharged, so on normal and hard it's easy to want to hold on to those charges for bosses. But being able to dodge an extra attack or one-shot an extra enemy can make maps a lot more manageable on Maddening, and it's often possible to recharge your emblems through combat or by using the blue spaces on the map that fill your meter up in one go. Determining when is the best time to activate your emblem rings and planning around their downtime is a very important part of the game, particularly when you only have a few emblems. You can always use all your rings at once to make part of a map easy, but then you'll have to deal with the rest of the map with no special powers for a while. If you save them all for the end though, you'll have made the map much harder on yourself than it needed to be. Throughout the rest of Engage's early to mid-game, you'll pick up a variety of emblems, each of which introduces a new thing to pay attention to. Sigurd can attack enemies in a line, so manipulating enemies such that they line up for him to strike becomes valuable. Micaiah's staves can hit up to 4 adjacent units, so you can heal a lot of additional damage per turn with careful positioning, or more excitingly, warp 4 units at once. Roy introduces terrain effects, as he can set the ground ablaze, dealing damage and inhibiting your enemy's movements. The first 6 emblems you get are fairly straightforward and mainly make you better at combat or provide simple to understand and use buffs like higher movement or greater range. Eventually though, you lose access to these rings and get a different 6, which provide powerful but less straightforward benefits. Things like Lynn's illusory doubles or Byleth's 4-way dance are incredibly powerful, but take some thought to get the most use out of them. In the end, you'll eventually have all of the rings, and mixing and matching units with different rings is fun because it's often difficult to decide who the best user of any given ring would be. What units you decide to equip each ring to has a significant effect on their capabilities as well. For example, Lynn provides her user with a ton of speed, so if you want a great knight that can double, you can throw Lynn on them and enjoy the benefits of her speed boost. Alternatively, you can throw Lynn on a faster unit, and they'll be able to double even the fastest enemies the game throws at you. Lucina can basically turn a regular unit into a backup unit, so she completely changes how you want to position whatever unit she's attached to. The emblem rings are some of the most fun in the game. It's a blast to figure out the best way to use the skills and special attacks they provide, like seeing if a 4-man warp can help you skip a difficult portion of a map, or using terrain to limit the amount of enemies that can attack you. There's also almost nothing in this series more satisfying than lining up a bunch of enemies for Sigurd's special attack. Notably, emblem rings level up as characters use them, and they can provide new skills and weapon proficiencies. Weapon proficiencies are key for reclassing units. For example, if you want to reclass Anna to take advantage of her magic growth, you're gonna want to attach her to a Celica ring to get a tome proficiency. The skills that each emblem provide can also be inherited. As units battle, they gain SP, which can be used to purchase skills from rings that they've bonded with. Once they equip the skill, they have access to it even if they aren't using the ring it's associated with. You can make some really disgusting units with the right skills. Since my team was filled with backup units, I made it a priority to get Lucina's Dual Assist Plus skill on as many of them as possible. This made it so that my units had a 70% chance of chain attacking any enemy within a walking distance of them, which allowed me to get an absurd amount of extra damage in every attack. Of course, this required me to make sure my team was full of backup units. Teams favoring mobility might instead go for Sigurd's momentum ability, which adds damage for each square you move before attacking. There's so much room for customization here that I think I could do a dozen more runs of this game before I even start to run out of ideas. The only issue with skills is that it takes forever to earn the currency used to buy them. While some skills are cheap, the most exciting ones can cost upwards of 2,000 SP, and you won't be affording that until the late mid-game. Some skills can cost even more than that. I really can't imagine grinding 4500 SP to afford some of the skills in a regular playthrough of Engage. I understand powerful skills need to be expensive, but I think a quicker rate of SP growth or a discount on the skills that seem totally out of reach would be appropriate, or there should be a new game plus where SP can be carried over. Without this, I can't see some of these really expensive skills ever being inherited. Engage also struggles a little bit with unit balance, especially once you hit the mid-game. You start getting a bunch of units that are just better than the units you have from the beginning of the game. On one hand, I love that the game gives you solid units throughout the game, allowing you to replace anyone that you lose along the way. It makes this game feel really Iron Man friendly compared to other recent Fire Emblem games. On the other hand, I do think there should at least be some early game units that can hold their own. In most Fire Emblem games, I love having a mix of characters from throughout the game, but in Engage, it often feels correct to bench early game units unless you've invested a ton of resources into them. This issue is exacerbated because your first Maddening playthrough must be done with fixed growths. This means that level ups aren't determined randomly and units will always perform according to their growth rates. Without fixed level ups, growth units in the early game have a chance of being stronger or weaker than average, so a character like Yunaka has a chance to get good level ups and have competitive stats with Zelkov at his join time, even without favoritism. With fixed growths, this doesn't really happen. In my playthrough, I used Yunaka a fair amount, but by the time I got Zelkov, he was better in almost every stat, some by a significant margin. Despite this, there is an important upside to fixed stats, which is that it makes the game easier to balance. The devs know that you aren't getting RNG screwed or blessed, and they know roughly what power level your army is at since the newest recruits will be among your best. This means they can design around those stat benchmarks without worrying about an unlucky player's bad level ups causing them to struggle. This works great in Engage, as it's one of the few Fire Emblem games where enemies feel like they keep up with your army. They rarely feel like pushovers, and outside of a couple powerful characters, you generally can't stat check your way to success in this game. Engage also boasts some of the best maps Fire Emblem has had in a while, and this is because of a few important features. One is that there are a lot fewer stationary bosses and enemies. If you try to turtle and take maps too slowly, often the enemies will come to you and you'll be overwhelmed. Instead, you need to be proactive and take out enemies on your turn so that you can avoid counterattacks and prevent a buildup of enemies that's too much for you to overcome. You may notice I've said a few times that you need to be proactive on player phase in this game, and I think that's part of what makes it so fun. This game is so player phase focused that you're constantly making decisions and seeing the outcomes of those decisions, rather than just putting a powerful unit out and waiting for the enemies to kill themselves on said powerful unit. Maps in Engage also include two important safety valves that prevent you from using your multiple warps, dances, and movement increases to dominate maps in 1 or 2 turns. The first feature is revival stones, which are typically carried by bosses. These stones basically act as extra health bars in that lowering a boss's HP to 0 just expends one of the stones instead of killing them. This makes it impossible to have one super good unit and have them rush the boss to end a map early. To take out a boss in a single turn, you will often need 3+ units and sometimes more for particularly tanky bosses. Revival stones alone wouldn't be enough to prevent cheesing maps, especially in a game with a 4-man warp. But it's paired with many maps including multiple bosses that need to be killed in order to complete them. Once you pass the early game, it becomes very common for maps to have 2 or more bosses that you need to kill, with some going as high as 6 bosses, all of whom have multiple health bars. There's no good way to skip a lot of these maps. Even if you wanted to do something like a 4-man warp, dance your warper, and then do another 4-man warp, you probably don't have 8 combat units that are strong enough to take out both bosses in 1 turn on Maddening mode. Though I bet you could come up with some really wild and fun skips on normal mode where your units are a bit stronger relative to the enemies. There are some maps that are pretty cheesable, but the majority of them demand that you play the maps honestly, at least until you get towards the end of the map, where you may be able to use a warp or a big 4-man dance to expedite the last boss kill. I loved this. Warp felt like an interesting tool that was fun to find the optimal use for, rather than just a means of turning my brain off and one-turning maps instead of engaging with them in a meaningful way. Maps in Engage are also designed for enemies to use tools that they don't always use in other Fire Emblem games. Most notably, there's multiple maps where enemies will warp their allies at you. In one map, I even saw a priest warp another priest so that that priest could warp a different faraway ally to get in range to hit me. I thought that was so cool. I hadn't even considered that as a possible thing that they could do until they did, and it made me think of enemies completely differently, as they use their staves in a much smarter manner in this game. One of my favorite maps in the game, and maybe even the whole series, was Chapter 17. This chapter has you facing off against 6 bosses, all of whom have emblem rings of their own, and can utilize the same shenanigans you've been using all game. You have to think about enemy warps and positioning your units so the boss with Sigurd can't get a good charge through all of your units. The first 3 bosses can largely be taken out individually, but the last 3 charge you together, making for an extremely hectic end to the map where you're taking on an overwhelming amount of enemies and 3 bosses all at once. Maps in Engage also do a great job of integrating the gameplay with the story. The best example of this is Chapter 11. The story of this chapter is that you've just lost your emblem rings and are grossly outnumbered. The way this is presented in gameplay is an escape map where you must run away from powerful units that approach you from behind, and what's worse is they're making use of the rings you just lost. This map makes you feel overwhelmed and a little hopeless in the same way the story's trying to do, but in a very organic way. There are tons of other small examples of gameplay story integration as well in Engage. In one late game chapter, the story tells you there's no humans left in a town you're fighting in. So I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when I visited one of the villages and monsters jumped out instead of finding a villager that gave me free stuff. This was a small thing, but it really made the map feel a little more attached to the story that was being told. Both of these maps are past the midpoint, and it's around then that strategies that worked in hard mode just don't work anymore. You need to take a different approach to maps and make better use of your emblems. For example, I wasn't overly impressed by the Corrin emblem in hard mode. Its main job is making terrain, but in hard mode this often seemed unnecessary compared to putting a combat ring on a Lear and letting them take on all comers. In Maddening mode though, making good use of Corrin's terrain power felt so essential that I now think it's the best ring in the game. Which is great because there's so many ways to use it. It's a joy trying to figure out whether you should be making an ice wall to block attacks, or fire to slow enemies down, or even fog to help your Kagetsu or Yunaka dodge attacks. What exact approach you want to take is highly impacted by what you've decided to do with your units. Any unit can be any class, so you can do what I did and focus on building a bunch of backup units for chain attacks, or you can focus more on mobility or a lot of magic users. Regardless of what you go with, how you use your rings and who ends up with which one is going to be completely different. I'm sure eventually people will settle on a meta for what the best class and ring options are, but for now it feels like most options are perfectly viable and it's fun thinking about what classes might best fit a unit. I even think Jean, this game's villager, is more interesting than a lot of villagers we've had in the past. His personal ability is that his class growths are doubled. This means that you have a ton of control over how his stats will turn out because you can pick whatever class gives him the stats that you want. If you want a fast unit, stick him in Swordmaster for a while and then switch him out once you want to focus on another stat. I just love the idea of a villager that excels in whatever area you focus them on, rather than one that's just good at everything. It means there's a little bit more decision making involved. And that's pretty much the whole story of Engage. There's a ton of decision making and a lot of it feels really meaningful and significant. Overall, Engage's mechanics and maps make for a really great Maddening experience. Usually when I finish Fire Emblem on the hardest difficulty, I just feel exhausted. But this time, I'm already thinking about what I want to do on my next run. I love the unit customization, and with so many ways to build your team, I think I'll have to come up with a lot of new strategies in my next run since I won't be loaded up with backup units. The difficulty of this mode feels challenging but not frustrating, and the emblems are a fantastic iteration on battalions and the gambits from Three Houses. So just in terms of gameplay, I have to give Engage Maddening and its mechanics an A+. I really think it's one of the best hard modes we've had in a very long time. If you want to try the game for yourself, boy do I have a giveaway for you. I wanted to thank you guys for helping me hit 1,000 subscribers, and what better way than to give away a copy of the game I just finished gushing about. I'm running the giveaway through Gleam, so all you have to do to enter is go to the link in the video description and fill in your name, email, and favorite Fire Emblem character. The form will close on Friday, February 17th, so make sure you get in there before then. You don't need to sub to the channel or like the video or anything to enter. That said, if you did enjoy the video, and you want to see more content like it, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload, and I hope you have a great week.